From the 1940s until as late as the 1970s, most consumer electronics were made with vacuum tubes. For instance, a TV would have about 20 to 25 vacuum tubes. Due to their complexity, TVs were quite large and very expensive, in today's money about $4,000. So for a long time, only the wealthy could afford a television. These TVs also used up a lot of power and produced a lot of heat. The transistor, which first emerged in the late 40s, could not be used at first in products that existed because transistors could not handle the power required to make a radio or a TV. The tech giants of the time, who made products using vacuum tubes, companies like RCA, General Electric, and Zenith and Westinghouse, got the license for transistors from Bell Labs and spent $3 billion in trying to make transistors good enough to be used in the products they were already manufacturing. In other words, they wanted a transistor to perform as well as vacuum tubes before introducing them into the market. In 1955, however, Sony released to the market the first transistor-based product, a crappy little pocket radio that cost at the time $2. It was terrible. The output was filled with static, producing a teeny sound, not anywhere near the quality of vacuum tube-based radios. Who could possibly want to buy such a terrible product? Teenagers, who can now for the first time in history have their own source of music due to the Sony radio's portability and listen to the controversial music of the time, rock and roll, without their parents knowing. Sony's transistor radio was terrible compared to the expensive products at the time, but it was good enough. It was about 1 billion times better than having nothing. Were teenagers sad with the static and teeny sound? No, they were absolutely delighted with the product. Can you think of a similar situation in the PC market today? The wealthy people who could afford vacuum tube TVs and radios judged them by the quality of the picture and the sound. The teenagers who bought a transistor radio judged it by the price, the portability, and the convenience. The sound quality was irrelevant. In 1959, Sony introduced the first small affordable television, and just like with their transistor radio, Sony's TV was terrible, but it only cost $99. So now the less wealthy could also have access to the television. They didn't care that the picture wasn't as good as the vacuum tube ones. They cared that Sony's crappy TV was roughly 1 billion times better than having zero TV. By 1965, Sony was making solid-state TVs that were actually good, and within 5 years, all of the vacuum tube companies disappeared from the market. If you've been following my channel, you'll be familiar with what I called AMD's Voltron chip. It's basically an SoC with a high core count and integrated Navi graphics. It's long been rumored that AMD has been developing Navi alongside Sony for their upcoming PlayStation 5. Obviously, there will be discrete GPUs based on Navi as a byproduct of this research and development work, but it seems clear by now that Navi's primary target platform is not the desktop PC, but consoles and APUs. Just recently, Komachi on Twitter posted the product code for what appears to be an AMD SoC with some interesting specs. Could this be the PlayStation 5 chip? We'll come back and analyze it in a second. One of the surprises for me from CES was seeing the consumer Ryzen 3000 series chip shown being chiplets based. I had predicted the consumer products would be monolithic in design rather than chiplets based, a prediction I got dead wrong. Sure, it makes a lot of sense from a financial perspective, especially considering AMD's commitments with global foundries and other factors. But for me, the problem with latency and locality always felt like it would represent costs to the performance that were greater than the financial benefits for bringing chiplets to the mainstream. Lisa Su has already confirmed that there will be another chiplet on that empty space in the die shown at CES, although she hasn't confirmed how many more cores we'll see. But there's also the possibility of adding a graphics chip in that space also, or at least so we thought. Just a couple of days after CES, an article was posted at AnandTech where Ian Cutress got to ask AMD about the Matisse design when it comes to implementing a graphics chip where that empty space is. And AMD's answer was straight to the point. There will be no version of the current Matisse chiplet layout where one of those chiplets will be graphics. Now, of course, there will be Zen 2 processors with integrated graphics, but those will be coming much later after desktop processors and will be built in a different design. I'm assuming here that this will be a monolithic design. So why are we getting chiplet CPUs but not chiplet APUs this year? So let's go back and look at this part that Komachi unearthed in more detail. It's an 8-core APU with a 3.2 GHz boost frequency and integrated Navi 10 graphics, the denomination here being Navi 10 Lite. There's an assumption here that the 1600 number refers to it being a Sony part because it's a somewhat similar product code to previous SoCs that AMD made for Sony. There's some substance to that, but not a lot to be honest. But so far this is the closest to a part that could resemble a console SoC that we've seen. So based on the specs alone, it does seem like this is either the PS5 chip or the next Xbox chip or a semi-custom design destined to a low-power console type of device. Now, why 3.2 GHz? You might think that this is because AMD will actually use the older Zen Plus cores instead of the new 7nm ones. After all, that is the base clock for the Ryzen 3700 for instance. But when you look at AMD's slides from the next Ryzen event, it says that 7nm provides 25 more performance at the same power or the same performance at half the power. Console chips need to be low power. They're inside a small thin enclosure, typically with basic cooling, so managing heat is a major concern. So I believe that this is indeed a 7nm processor based on Zen 2 and not Zen Plus, but optimized for low power rather than high frequencies. This also makes sense in terms of the target performance that Sony is looking for the PS5, native 4K resolution at 60 frames per second. Your bottleneck at native 4K will always be the GPU, not the CPU, so you don't need a particularly high clocking CPU in this scenario, so keeping the clocks low will help with the overall efficiency of the machine. Now, what about that Navi 10 Lite? What does that mean? I suspect that we're not talking about the full Navi here, which is roughly equivalent in performance to an RTX 2070 or a GTX 1080. This sounds to me like the cut-down version of Navi, which will be more in the GTX 1070 range or in line with a Vega 56. But could that do 4K 60? Yeah, it definitely could, especially when you consider how games are optimized for console hardware. Game developers will tune each graphical setting specifically to a console spec so that they can eliminate any bottlenecks to the performance while still maintaining good quality visuals. As PC enthusiasts, it's sometimes hard for us to put things into perspective because of how demanding it is to run games at 4K in our machines. And it also shows what a poor job most game developers do when optimizing for our platform. At the end of the day, it really all comes down to optimization, which is the bread and butter of console development. So yes, the cut-down Navi is perfectly fine for 4K 60 on a console. So in current PC hardware terms, it looks like the PS5 will have hardware equivalent to an 8-core Ryzen 2700 running at its base frequency with a Vega 56 or GTX 1070, but in 7nm and optimized for low power draw. Actually doesn't sound that impressive, does it? Well, remember, this is all in an SoC. These are not separate components, it's a single chip. Can you imagine the implications this will have on the PC market when AMD releases an equivalent part in APU form? Well, let's again look to history to understand how the technology market will evolve. The computer industry has been around long enough for us to identify certain patterns, and we'll be talking about some of them in future videos, but the one that interests us the most today is the pattern of sustained innovation versus disruptive innovation, or what Clayton Christensen calls the theory of disruption. I'll put a link in the video description to a very interesting book from 1997 on this topic called The Innovator's Dilemma. So if you find this video interesting and want to dig deeper, it's definitely a good read. Pretty much every segment and niche of the tech world has gone through these phases of sustained innovation for some periods of time that eventually end with a disruptive technology taking over, just like we saw earlier with the Sony transistor radios and TVs crushing the vacuum tube industry. Here's an easy way to visualize it. The product performance and the time or engineering effort that takes to get to that performance is characterized by an S-curve. S-curve. You can use pretty much any product here, but for the sake of this exercise, let's use those massive disk drives from the 1940s and 50s that were used in mainframe computers. There's a first stage where the product is invented and the performance at this point is really poor, and it takes several years of trial and error development until it really starts becoming relevant in the market. Then there's a second stage where the experience gathered in the first stage leads to the pace of development really picking up, and the performance increases are tremendous. This is the maturity stage of the product. And then there's a third stage where in order to achieve even very small improvements in performance, you need a lot of time and engineering effort. As you get closer to tapping out on that technology's potential, you have to spend a lot of time and resources to get even a small 10% or 20% improvement in performance. You can look at any technological advancement in the last 80 years and you'll find this S-curve. So at what point do successful disruptive technologies emerge? Typically and historically, they happen precisely at the inflection point. And again, the cycle repeats itself. When they first appear as a new solution, they have very little application in the market because the performance levels are very poor. Like we saw with the transistor example at the beginning of the video, the established companies typically see these new innovations as having potential, sure, but not really providing value to their current customers. If they don't perform as well as their existing products, why bring them to the market? But just like with the Sony cheap transistor radios and TVs, or in the hard drive industry with the introduction of small hard drives that the emerging personal computer market needed, when the second stage of this new technology takes place, the older one usually gets completely outclassed and in most cases ends up disappearing, and a lot of companies with them. I could list about 80 to 100 companies that at one point in time existed in the hard drive industry alone, and who have disappeared never to be seen again because they failed to understand the potential of new incumbent technologies. Of course, the beauty of it all for us consumers is that this cycle doesn't stop, and we are ultimately the ones that benefit from new disruptive technologies the most. When you take a look at these markets today, you see how the S-curve for SSDs and flat-screen TVs gradually replace the older technologies. What comes next? Maybe Intel's Optane persistent memory will take over SSDs, and stretching panels that can go from the size of a phone to a computer monitor and stretch all the way up to the size of TVs will take over the flat screen market someday. Who knows? So what does this all have to do with the PlayStation 5 and AMD and the GPU market? Well, let's look at the S-curve for Nvidia's GPUs since the node shrink to 40 nanometers. We can see that the GTX 580 was 25% faster than the 480, the 680 was 23% faster than the 580, then the 780 was 21% faster than the previous generation. So we see a small increase in performance from 2010 to 2014, when suddenly there's a jump of 38% with a 980, then 2 years later a 61% increase with a 1080, and finally jump to the end of last year and we get about a 20% increase from the 1080 to the 2080. There will be small variations to these numbers depending on what sources you use, but you will end up with an S-curve shape that looks like it's about to enter the flattening stage. The rumors are that the successor to the RTX cards will come out in 2020. I think Nvidia might be forced to launch the next RTX cards at the end of this year, but we'll see. Regardless, we're bound to get less and less performance as time goes on, at about a 20% increase every couple of years, and those performance increases will be mostly down to architectural improvements and software optimization. If we look at APUs on the other hand, you can see how long it took for AMD to get those original Llano-based APUs, which provided basic graphics performance, to a performance level with the 2400G launched in early 2018 that can actually be a valid replacement for entry-level GPUs. But when you chart this leaked APU from Komachi on the graph, you see a massive jump in performance by 2020. This is in line with Christensen's theory of disruption, and by around 2023 we could see APUs match the performance levels of high-end GPUs. Sounds crazy? I'm just looking at what history has to teach features, and time and again, in pretty much every sector of the PC market, this is what happened. Now, it's unclear where exactly those lines will cross. It could be later, but the writing is definitely on the wall if you ask me. Now, of course, AMD are not the only company making SoCs like this. You should check out my video about ARM if you want to know more about what's over the horizon. And this leads us to a question we posed earlier. So we know that AMD's APUs will pose a real threat to GPUs, but according to AMD themselves, we won't be seeing these in 2019 in chiplets form. So again, why is AMD bringing chiplets CPUs to the market in 2019 but not chiplets APUs? The answer, I believe, is in a combination of latency, locality, and most importantly, power. I'm sure you've heard of Moore's law and of how it's slowing down. We will still be able to increase the number of transistors in dies for a few years to come, but performance really won't increase much through sheer node shrinks or increased transistor counts. CPUs are getting wider, in other words, they're getting more cores, but they're not really getting faster. What you might not have heard of is Dennard scaling. I won't get too much into it as this video has gotten technical enough, but basically Dennard suggested that as we get more transistors into chips, the performance per watt would also improve exponentially. And that was indeed the case all the way up to the year 2005, when we tapped out on the power mine. In other words, in 2005 we reached a limit when it comes to performance per watt where we are forced to make a choice between increased performance at the same power or the same performance at lower power whenever we move to a new node. You can see in AMD's slides as recently as the Radeon 7 announcement that the increase in performance is usually accompanied by the expression at the same power. When Lisa demoed the 8-core Ryzen 3600 versus the 9900K, power draw was shown right at the center of the screen. This is because ever since the end of Dennard scaling, power is performance. With all this talk about 7nm and 5nm, the node really isn't as important as it used to be. Here's a quote from Bill Daly, Nvidia's chief scientist, on the topic of node shrinks. Process doesn't matter that much. It used to be that if you were a process node behind, you were dead. Your competitor's product was 2.8 times better. Now, if you're a node behind, if you're clever, you can make that 20% disadvantage on better architecture and better circuits. This was said around the time that the Turing cards were being developed, so you can see why today the RTX 2080 Ti at 12nm is much faster than the Radeon 7 at 7nm. So if power is performance and what gets you an advantage in the processing war is better architectures and better circuits, what AMD will be working on right now is precisely in smarter ways to handle the energy efficiency of this new chipless-based design, especially when it comes to adding a graphics chiplet in there. I know that this talk about power is a bit abstract. You see a lot of talk about this topic, but no one ever delves a bit deeper, which is why I think it's still a very underrated metric. Most of you probably couldn't care less about power and energy unless you are a fan of small ITX builds, so I'll try and give you a very quick and admittedly crude explanation that's a bit less abstract, so that we can understand what really matters in this environment where things are energy limited. So looking at a hypothetical chip as an example that has 20mm on one side, so a fairly large die but still smaller than, for instance, a 2080 Ti. If you have a processing unit in there and you perform some arithmetic on it, for instance, let's say this is a double precision floating point unit, even though in reality it would be much smaller in size, the power cost would be around 20 picojoules. Now actually feeding that operation, so if we move around 4 doubles in the instruction and we move them 1mm on a 256-bit bus, it actually takes more energy to move them than to actually do the operation on those bits, about 26 picojoules. So the actual operation inside those processing units has almost no cost in terms of energy. It's moving the bits around that's the real issue. And those bits that we're moving, those 4 64-bit words plus the instruction, they had to come from somewhere. For instance, they were read from memory. How much energy does that take? Another 50 picojoules. So if we read this data from memory and move it 1mm, we've now used 76 picojoules. That's almost 4 times more energy than the actual arithmetic operation that's happening inside that computer. compute unit. What if we have to move the bits 10mm? It will take 256 picojoules, so more than 10 times the amount of energy. If you were to move the bits from one corner of the chip to the opposite corner, it would take 40 times the amount of energy. And if you had to move those bits outside the chip, for instance to access DRAM, it's 100 times or more energy than doing the actual operation. So you can see that running the operations isn't actually what requires more energy, but rather moving bits around. For this reason, CPUs are optimized for latency caches. In my video from a couple of months ago where I predicted what the Zen 2 CPUs and APUs would be like, I said that Zen 2 would have 4 MB of L3 cache per core. This increased cache size, along with the new Infinity Fabric, is what is allowing AMD to have this chiplets-based architecture in separate dies without affecting the performance and the latency. Presumably, we'll have to see the actual chips to see if that's the case. So as we move to these chiplet designs, energy management becomes ever more important. Moving bits from a chiplet to the I/O through high-speed links will have a great cost in energy. I don't know how much. In fact, the example I gave you probably doesn't quite match the numbers on 7nm. There is no information on how much energy the Infinity Fabric links use. I would guess around 500 picojoules, but that's just me speculating. Whatever it is, there will be a significant cost. We have further evidence that AMD will spend the next couple of years addressing this issue from Mark Papermaster himself, who said back in November of last year, a 7nm plus node using extreme ultraviolet lithography will primarily leverage efficiency with some modest device performance opportunities. That's Zen 3 that he was referring to, which is planned to come to market in 2020. So this is AMD's great challenge with Navi-based APUs, including the one that will be used in the PS5, and one that I believe AMD will solve. When in the past I've mentioned APUs taking over, people have always said that this will never happen because of the limitations in energy usage. But you can think of vacuum tubes as the 2080 Ti's of the world, and APUs as Sony's crappy little pocket transistor radio. The PC market is changing to the point where you either spend a fortune on a 4K monitor plus a GPU capable of pushing 4K, or you stick to the hardware you already have with very little incentive to upgrade. And for new customers, the next generation of PC gamers who don't yet have a PC, whether or not this really is the PS5 chip, it represents what they will be gaming on in the next few years. APUs are all they need to play Fortnite and whatever takes Fortnite's place. And if Christensen's theory of disruption is correct, by around 2023, we might all be perfectly happy with just an APU. This video is made possible by my awesome patrons. Seeing as my channel is growing, it looks like I will soon have the ability to receive your support directly through YouTube. But until that option is available, consider supporting me on Patreon for just $1 per month and get exclusive access to the Cortex Discord server. Thanks for watching, and until the next one.